Sean O'Rourke has an interesting question here I want to address. Sean says, was the banjo popular pre-Civil War in the 1830s sort of era? So yeah, Sean, I mean, so people will argue about this. If you ask me, and I think I'm right, the banjo was already popular by about 1740, believe it or not. And that's when you see the first earliest accounts. And if you're talking about mainland North America, the earliest account in mainland North America, I believe it's about 1740, late 1700s, 1740 in New York City. And the guy just says, yeah, he describes walking out of New York into the countryside outside of town, and he's observing a bunch of black people having a party, a Pentecost party, and there's a banjo present. And this, I want to say, is the late 1730s. And you can tell by the way some of these early accounts discuss the banjo. They don't describe what it is. They don't act like it's this strange alien thing they've never seen before. They merely say in these earliest accounts, this person was playing a banjo. And the reader is just assumed to already have seen a banjo, heard it. And this is in New York City. So shortly thereafter, you get a flood of banjo accounts from places like Maryland and Virginia, all through beginning in the 1740s. And these are mostly from runaway slave advertisements in the newspaper, where they say, you know, the subscriber so-and-so is reporting that his slave ran away. He may have a banjo with him, or he's a good banjo player, etc. And again, in all of those advertisements, they're not explaining what the banjo is, because by 1740, if you lived in Maryland or Virginia, you were already very familiar with the banjo. So honestly, I want to say by 1750, the banjo was already very widespread. It probably didn't enjoy a lot of popularity in the so-called white community, but among enslaved people, among indentured servants, it was well known. And certainly by 1780, we know for a fact that it was a solid central part of even lower class, working class white folk culture, because you have all kinds of accounts come out in the 1770s, 1780s of white folks dancing to the banjo. So again, I always say I don't really care what color these people are, but it is important to observe and note when the banjo quote unquote jumped the color line. And it happened very early on. It happened in the 1700s. And it just indicates how widespread and how popular the instrument had become. By 1780, we have white people, rural white people in North Carolina are dancing to the gourd banjo. In 1790 in Kentucky, we have a group of Virginians that came from Appomattox Courthouse. They carried their slaves with them over the mountain, over Cumberland Gap, trying to get into Kentucky. This was 1781. There's an account of them forcing the slaves to play the banjo for them at one point, so we know it was a big deal. And then as early as 1790, we have an account of a guy whose name, we only know his name was Mr. Rector. Locals called him Old Leatherstocking. Old Leatherstocking Rector in East Kentucky in the 1790s. He's documented as making banjo strings from deer intestines. They don't mention him playing, but they mention that those deer gut banjo strings were just as important to him as his food and clothing. So that to me tells me that Old Leatherstocking, who presumably was Caucasian, was Anglo-American, that tells me that Old Leatherstocking, Mr. Rector, he was a banjo player. So Sean, if you want to talk about mainstream popularity of the banjo, yes, that was not until the 1830s. And that was when you had really Joel Sweeney in the 1830s blacked himself up and became the first minstrel. There were blackface minstrels before Joe Sweeney, who was a Virginian, sort of middle upper class Virginian, but he was the first blackface minstrel to actually bring the banjo to the minstrel stage. He played in circuses and eventually on the stage. And he was also the first guy that's one thing that's interesting about Sweeney, is that every single account of the banjo before Sweeney, it's described, when it is described, as a gourd instrument, usually with just 3 or 4 strings or less. But as soon as Sweeney hits the stage, the gourd banjo almost disappears from the historical record, and the 3- and 4-string banjos almost disappear from the historical record. Suddenly, in the 1830s, with the rise of Sweeney, you see the round wooden frame bent wood hoop banjo with an actual wooden pot and 5 strings. So that's led a lot of people to claim sort of wild things that Sweeney invented the 5-string banjo, etc. Which I don't. There's no evidence. There's no reason to believe that. I'm sure that Sweeney just basically learned everything from the slaves on his father's plantation outside of Lynchburg, and I imagine that that's what those enslaved musicians were playing on. They, the technology required to steam bend a hoop and make a drum and put a neck on it. That was clearly already around.